Arts and Science presentation. Thanks everyone for coming. I think most of you know, but in case anyone doesn't, there are bathrooms down the hall, behind Lou over there, and to the right. I do want to announce our next presentation is June 8th at 2 p.m. and we're going to try and do these at 2 p.m. in the future rather than 3 p.m., so just keep that in mind. Our next presentation will be Zebeth, I honestly don't know how to pronounce her name, Zebeth Falden. She will be talking about the intersection of science and art, and we thought that is a great fit for an organization called the Yachats Academy of Arts and Sciences. She has a workshop next week at the Sitka Center up the north coast. I'm not sure exactly what town it is. She will have books available, and she can sign her books if you want to purchase her books. For today, I want to thank Swifty, Swallows in Flight to Yachats, and the Audubon Society of Lincoln City for helping bring Dr. Sarah Rockwell to our attention and helping coordinate this event. I also want to thank, if anyone's here from the Adobe Resort, they were graciously helped with the lodging. Today's presentation is on GPS tracking of purple martins to Brazil and back. There are approximately 3,500 pairs of the western subspecies of purple martins, and they are considered a species of conservation concern, which I presume is a little lower down than endangered or threatened. Swifty has been installing nesting boxes throughout Lincoln County for various species, including purple martins, and that is one of their reasons for helping to bring Dr. Rockwell here. Sarah got her BA in biology from Kalamazoo College and her PhD at the University of Maryland and Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center. She manages several bird programs at the Klamath Bird Observatory, using several methodologies that I'm going to leave to her to explain. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sarah Rockwell.
Hi everybody. I'm going to see how I do balancing this on my ear rather than hold it. Yeah, it's hitting my glasses. I might just have to hold it. Yeah, so I'm Sarah Rockwell. I'm very happy to be here today to talk to you about our purple martin research. It's exciting that so many folks are interested in what we're doing with these awesome birds. And I'd like to just first off thank my colleagues who have helped with this research, including Deanna Williams, Joan Hager, and Joe Metzler, who's in the audience today. So if you're not familiar with KBO, we're a nonprofit based in Southern Oregon in Ashland. And our mission is to advance bird and habitat conservation through science education and partnerships. So we do that through collaborative conservation planning. The main kind of themes that we work under are long-term monitoring, applied ecology, and theoretical research. And we do focus on our home region of the Klamath-Siskiyou bioregion in Southern Oregon and Northern California. But we also work throughout the Pacific Northwest through the Avian Knowledge Network, which is our online data repository that we co-host with Point Blue Conservation Science, and have lots of scientists contributing bird data to that so we can pool it all together in one place and make the best use of it for land management. And we also work with international partners to try to protect our shared migratory birds throughout their ranges throughout the year. And we'll talk more about that, how that relates to the purple martin research. Another quick shout out to the research team. Here's some photos of everybody. Deanna Williams works for the Forest Service. I'm at Klamath Bird Observatory, as we mentioned. Joan Hager's recently retired from USGS in Corvallis. And then Joe Metzler from Cape Arago Audubon has worked very diligently to help us maintain boxes and do resighting. Sam Webb at KBO helped with last year's effort banding. And I'll talk more about this in the talk too, but Daniel Farrar is at USACE Fern Ridge, where we've done our latest round of tagging, and he's a biologist there that also helped drive a boat, which I'll get into why we needed a boat for this research. So the western purple martin, or the purple martin species as a whole, is North America's biggest swallow. They're an aerial insectivore, so that means they feed on the wing. They hunt flying insects, like while they're also in the air. And that is partly what contributes to their conservation status. So we have a lot of concern for aerial insectivores in general, because you may have heard of, we really have some broad insect declines kind of across the US and even across the world, probably largely due to the increased use of agricultural insecticides and pesticides. So there are a lot of aerial insectivores that we consider to be of elevated conservation concern. And if you look at all of the Pacific Northwest states, they're considered some kind of special species by almost every agency you can think of. So Forest Service and BLM call it a sensitive species. It's a conservation strategy for the species for the state of Oregon. It's actually a candidate species for listing as threatened or endangered in Washington. And is also on the British Columbia Blue List, which is their system of classifying species of concern. And as Adam mentioned, they're thought to have only about 3,500 pairs in the Pacific Northwest states. So that's a pretty small population size, especially compared to the broader purple martin species as a whole. And like so many of our birds, we just don't really have a good grasp of why they are smaller population size, and perhaps more why they aren't rebounding after some long-term declines over maybe the last 100 years, why the population size is still staying so small. And we'll get into some of the reasons of why that can be difficult to determine for a migratory bird. So this is a range map I borrowed from a paper by Wiggins in 2005 that shows where all three subspecies live. You can see the eastern subspecies is the most widespread. It's in the purple. An interesting thing about this species is that the eastern subspecies is that they're completely man-made nest box dependent. So we no longer know of any natural cavity nesting populations. So they only use the kind of white gourds or maybe apartment houses. You might have seen pictures of these. Which is an interesting conservation dilemma, because as purple martin landlords, as they call themselves, retire and decommission their martin apartments, it's starting to be a bit of an issue, because the eastern martins don't use natural snags anymore. So even though they're widespread, they are still considered at least of some concern. And then we have the western subspecies here. There's both a bit of a coastal population and also some in the Rocky Mountains, even getting down into Arizona, New Mexico, maybe even northern Mexico. I think on that map, the red and the green are a bit in contention of, we don't really know exactly where the subspecies boundaries are. But yeah, the western subspecies has this kind of disjunct population, coastal and Rocky Mountains. And our western subspecies more often still nests in natural snags. So they do some nest box use, but they also still use natural snags a lot. And as a cavity nester, like all non-woodpecker cavity nesters, they don't excavate their own cavities. They have to use an old woodpecker nest. So the woodpeckers have the strong beaks. They're the ones that dig out those nests, and then lots of other bird species will use them the many years after the woodpeckers are done with it. Another really interesting subspecies is the desert one, which is largely in Arizona and New Mexico, and they actually nest in saguaro cacti. So I pulled up a couple pictures of that. Purple martins perched on a cactus, and then the picture on the right is some folks I know at the Tucson Audubon Society who are attempting to capture those birds, and that's why they have these very tall poles with a net in between them, trying to get at these birds that are nesting, 20 feet high in an old growth saguaro. Yeah, so that's an interesting a bit of information about that subspecies, which is really different than the one we have here. But in general, we have a lot of gaps in our knowledge about these different subspecies. Most of what we know is about the eastern subspecies, which is obviously more widespread and abundant, and it's a lot more well studied. So we have a lot of information about that, but we don't necessarily know if all that information is transferable to the western subspecies. There could still be some key differences. And some of those differences have to do with the year-round biology of this bird. So scientists have recognized and are continuing to recognize the importance of studying birds year-round. So knowing where they spend the winter, where they're stopping over on fall migration and spring migration, knowing those areas and what threats they might be facing in those areas is really important and is a key research need for figuring out what conservation actions need to take place. So you can imagine they're only here in Oregon from approximately April to August, and that's where we can observe them and study them more carefully. But there's a whole bunch of things that can happen throughout the year, those other 7 or 8 months when they're not here, that also can affect their population size. And that's something that we just so far know very little about. So prior to our study with the GPS tagging, we did have a little bit of a hint that our western martins travel to southeastern Brazil. A previous study using light level geolocators, which is an entirely different type of technology. It estimates latitude and longitude based on the timing of sunrise and also day length. So there was a time when we didn't have tags small enough to put on a martin to collect GPS points, and so instead researchers used these light level geolocator tags. And this study by Fraser et al. In 2012 looked at a bunch of different populations across the US and determined their approximate wintering grounds. So what they found is that the eastern purple martins pretty much winter exclusively in the northwestern Brazilian Amazon. And so if you look at the figure I borrowed from their paper there, the whole kind of right-hand side of the clock are all places where the eastern purple martins were going. And then the one I've circled in red is our western subspecies. And they tagged a handful of birds in British Columbia and found that they seem to have an entirely different overwintering area than the more common eastern subspecies. So that's a really interesting hint, but at the same time, it's only a handful of birds. They were from British Columbia, so we don't necessarily know if Oregon, Washington, California martins do the same thing. And also these geolocators, they have a bigger margin of error. So you're getting a general location within, maybe even a couple hundred kilometers, which isn't necessarily precise enough to say, okay, here's where those birds are roosting, where they're spending the night, here's the exact kind of area we need to think about protecting. It's also very possible, so the Amazon, while it is undergoing deforestation, is still a wide swath of intact forest for the most part. And it's possible that if our birds are going to southeastern Brazil instead, that there may be facing more threats due to agriculture or conversion for human development. So we did kind of want to know that. Is it possible that our western subspecies are facing more dangers on the wintering grounds than the eastern subspecies? So now we have these newer archival GPS tags that are small enough to place on purple martins. And they really provide unprecedented precision in determining some of those locations that we talked about having an important conservation need. However, there is still a key caveat, which is that they're store on board only. The battery cannot weigh enough to be powerful enough to transmit any data. So I can't just sit back at my computer and wait for the birds to send their signals back to me. Instead, we have to wait for them to go through this entire round-trip migration, hope they survive, hope they come back to somewhere we can find them, and then recapture the tag, get the bird, and then take the tag off, and that's the only way we can get these data back. So that's its own interesting challenge. But yeah, so our objectives were to find out, where do the purple martins nesting in Oregon go? So what are the precise roosting sites they're using during fall migration, during winter, and if possible during spring migration, although we knew the batteries were unlikely to last that long. But yeah, we decided to focus on those roosting sites because it is more of a precise location where lots of birds might gather together to spend the night. And so those were kind of our first interesting target for thinking about needs for protecting habitat. So yeah, we wanted to identify the potential threats occurring at those sites, think about what conservation actions might be needed, and then also identify and talk to international partners, researchers in Brazil and other countries in Central America that might be, on the ground working and have some ideas for the best things that we could do. So in summers 2020 to 2022, we captured 23 western purple martins that were breeding in coastal Oregon. So we had a few sites highlighted on the map, one at the mouth of 10 Mile Creek, but the 10 Mile Creek down by Lakeside, not the one that's quite close to here, at the mouth of the Silk Coast River, and we also did some birds at Waite Ranch, which is a Mackenzie River Trust property that's just a little bit inland from Florence. And I was going to mention those nest box colonies that are out on the dunes. You can see the photo here. They're really close to the ocean, right in the sand. And this is part of a program being set up by Joe Metzler, which the idea was to have the purple martins help the snowy plovers, which is another bird of conservation concern that lives here locally. I'm sure you guys have heard of it since they nest out on these beaches just right here. And so the idea with that was if we place nest boxes near where the snowy plovers nest, purple martins that live in colonies have a mobbing behavior where if they see avian predators like crows, ravens, northern harriers, they chase them, dive at them, try to peck at them, that kind of thing that we call mobbing. And so the hope was if we put those boxes close to the beach, the purple martins might help chase off avian predators, birds that might be otherwise trying to catch and eat the snowy plover chicks. So that was kind of the origin of why those nest boxes existed in those places. The other thing with the tags is you have to program them. So my picture on the right there shows a bunch of those tags in a row waiting for me to send them a GPS schedule with my laptop. So you can only get a maximum of 80 GPS fixes, and in reality, you usually get more like 50. And you have to decide when you want the tag to take those. So not only it can't transmit, it does have limited storage capacity. We can only get a discrete number of those GPS fixes, so it's not just constantly taking a track the entire time it's out flying around. So we decided we'd take fixes every few days during what we guessed would be spring and fall migration when they'd be more on the move, and a little bit less often every 5 or 6 days during kind of the midwinter when we thought they might be more stationary. It was also an interesting challenge to figure out what time to set the tags to collect the GPS fix, because as I mentioned, we wanted to get at night roosts, and these birds are going through 5 different time zones as they migrate. So trying to guess what time they might be in, the western versus mountain, central, eastern, and then Brazil even goes further east than that, was also an interesting challenge. So we picked a time that would be between 10 p.m. and 3 a.m., kind of no matter what time zone the bird was in, assuming that would be a good time to get a night roost when they're perched somewhere and stationary for the evening. And here's some photos of how we do the captures. We use a bird backpack. Canvas rucksack, we just put the GPS tag in there. Thank you. That was some lame biologist humor. The backpacks do not look like that. So yeah, let's see. There's the real one. It's much smaller. So it can be efficient to do these captures at night while the birds are sleeping. And so that's why we're doing night work. The females are nearly always in the boxes at night, and sometimes the males are in there with them. And that's a time when you can just kind of sneak up on them, plug the cavity entrance, and then take the box down and just pick them up out of the boxes. So it's, some logistics to do this all by headlamp and in the middle of the night and whatnot, but It is kind of efficient because most of them are sleeping in there at this time of day. And then we fit on those GPS tags using leg loop harnesses. So in some senses it is like a backpack, like one loop goes on one leg, and the unit, you can probably see, you can see the little white tag on top of the unit, at least in that photo, sits on kind of the small of their back right above the tail, and then the other leg loop goes up the other leg. And as I mentioned, after all that, careful calculation, programming the tags, going out at night, the real trick is finding them again and recapturing them again after they come back. And then we also, I guess since that wasn't challenging enough, last year we put out 8 tags at Fern Ridge, the reservoir that's right outside of Eugene. So I think we're up to 31 tags total that are out there, a couple of which we've gotten back. But the nest boxes at Fern Ridge are all planted, like they're attached to the logs or fake snags they're plunked into the lake. So you have to get there on a boat or wade. So that middle picture is me. Oh, I'm not on that one yet, sorry. But yes, so this photo is us at night. We're actually on a boat and we're doing our tagging, trying from there. So we're kind of interested to see where our return rates were best, seeing how that's the biggest challenge with this type of research. We wanted to experiment with a couple different places and see if any one of them tended to get more of them back. Okay, and here's this picture. So yeah, the day after tagging, we would go out to these sites, or sometimes up to a week later, and kind of check on them, make sure the birds are flying in and out of the boxes and doing everything they're supposed to be doing, feeding their babies, etc. So there's using a scope to kind of check out some of those dunes birds, and then there's Sam and I in kayaks and waders going out to Fern Ridge and watching those birds and making sure they can still get in and out of the cavities easily, and that they're present and behaving normally, basically. And after that, there's not much you can do but cross your fingers and hope that some of them make it back. Which, spoiler alert, they did. So in spring of 2021, Joe, our super volunteer and nest box manager, he spent a lot of time out there watching these boxes and waiting for these birds to come back. And we were very excited when he found the first returning tagged female. And we were able to capture her, and the tag worked, and it collected data from July 2020 all the way through March 2021. So that's a bit of a preview of the route that we were able to track this particular bird from doing. So, we nicknamed her Roxa, which means purple in Brazilian Portuguese. I know the spelling's not phonetic to an English speaker, but I've been told it's Roxa. And so, after finishing breeding in Oregon, she moved a little bit inland, headed south into California, and then Baja California, and then proceeds through western Mexico. We have points from Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Colombia, Venezuela, and then she moves through the Amazon region of Brazil, so probably seeing or maybe even roosting with some of her eastern purple martin cousins, but then continuing on, kind of hopping over them and moving all the way to the southeast coast of Brazil. So this is just a little bit of a closer look at that spot in Baja California Sur. She actually does an extended fall stopover here. She spends about a month there, which in general for songbirds is unusual, to have such long stopovers during migration. And it does align with some of the data that I think is unpublished, but Bruce Cousins in British Columbia has a few more of those geolocator tracks that kind of show a similar pattern. And it's also really interesting, it's parallel to something the eastern purple martins do, which is stop for quite a while in the Yucatan on their way south. So we have these two birds coming from the different sides of the country, stopping in different sides of Mexico, and then continuing on to Brazil. So we're kind of curious about why such a long stop over there. It's possible that those are really productive saltwater bays, marshes, maybe even mangroves. Clearly the next step is for me to go visit there and see what's there on the ground. But yeah, I think it's possible that she's stopping there to molt feathers. It's another really energetically demanding time during a bird's life, and so it might be a good time, if that has a really good insect population, maybe that's a good time to stop for a while and kind of fuel up while you're molting those feathers. But we don't know that for sure, that's speculation. I also wanted to highlight some of the locations she used in southeastern Brazil. So she hits Brazil in late October in the state of Amazonas, and then she has another one of these long stopovers, so another 3 or 4 weeks in the state of Brazil called Minas Gerais. And those spots are right in a national park called the Cavernas do Piraçu, and they have these really interesting, this photos from there, limestone caves and like waterfalls running through these kind of caves and a lot of carved out limestone, and it's really interesting to think about, I wonder where exactly she is in those habitats. Is she in the trees or is she in these caves or anything? And then she hits the Brazilian coast in the state of Bahia, right about mid-December, and then ends in the state of Espírito Santo, which is where kind of all those swirly lines are down in the south, because she moves around a bit down there, but she stays there until at least March 19, which is when the battery on the GPS tag died. So we don't know exactly when she left, and we don't have a spring migration track, but I also wanted to point out in this city here called Linhares, a lot of the points where she's roosting are on an exact straight line that looks like they're more or less over a highway or a major road, which is interesting. Why is she choosing to sleep there instead of, and in this photo you can even see a little bit to the west, it looks like more of a marshy natural area, which presumably that's where she's foraging, but is choosing to come back into the city to sleep. So we're also curious about that. Are those power lines, telephone lines? Are there trees lining the boulevard? So it's a really interesting pattern to see that straight line. We'll get into that a little bit more later. And then finally, at the end of the winter, she makes it to the beach, right in time for Carnival. So she's here in, it's called Praia do Moro, is the beach in the city of Guarapari. And it's probably a little difficult to see, well, maybe not. So some of those green dots are right along the beach. So she's choosing some places to sleep that are, again, in a bit of a line, but right along the beach. So similar questions: is there a line of trees there? Is there a power line there? What structure is there that she's likely to be sleeping on? And anyway, she more or less, she roosted in this town at least 5 nights, and is kind of in this area on and off from early January to late February. So while we're busy digesting all that really cool new information we now have, all these precise roosts for this one individual, but meanwhile in Oregon, just in 2023, this past summer, Joe spotted not 1, but 2 more purple martins with tags coming back, and he was able to capture both of those. So you can see here some photos with this really cool box grabber pole that he can lift in the air and use to gently lift those boxes down once the birds are roosting in there at night. And then there's a photo of the tag, the harness snipped off. So yeah, now the bird is relieved of her burden and we get our data. Everybody wins. And it's really exciting to see a couple new pieces of data, because these 2 new females do not follow the exact same route, but there are a lot of parallels. So both of the new captures also did a long stopover in western Mexico, but on the other side of the Gulf of California. So in Sonora and Sinaloa states. So we have 3 different spots, and all 3 are doing that longer stopover that we don't know exactly what they're doing there why they're doing that, but it seems to be a common pattern so far. And one of those birds also did something really interesting in Central America. So you can see the track comes through El Salvador into Nicaragua and then stops and flies backwards about 200 miles. And this, I mean, we only have 3 data points, but this is not something we'd seen before, and we were very curious, like, what is this bird doing? Why would it fly so far back? And so, based on a hunch, we looked at NOAA's National Hurricane Center database, and we found out, it's just lined up perfectly, Hurricane Julia happened on that exact day in pretty much that spot, like crossed her path in Nicaragua on that day. So the day she turned around is when that, I think it was a tropical storm and intensified to a hurricane right then. So that bird knew what it was doing. It looked crazy, but it knew what it was doing. It went backwards, avoided the hurricane, hung out for, maybe it was about a week, and then kept going on its migration after that danger was past. And out of the 3 we have back, all 3 are shown, the little tracks are shown in that bigger picture. 2 of them used that Linares roost in that town I was talking about temporarily in the early winter. So far, none of the tracks have shown spring migration, but that's not terribly surprising. It's kind of pushing the limit of the batteries on these units. One of the new birds stayed in the state of Bahia. So that was another new piece of information. So far, everyone else had wintered in Espiritu Santo. And then, yeah, one track ended in January, one in March. But still, every bird we get back, we're just gaining new information from each one. And as far as the latest developments, I don't know if you remember, so here's that city of Linares where it looks like the birds might be roosting over the highway. 2 out of the 3 tracked birds spent some time there. And now we have, well, not we have, but there's a Brazilian PhD student named Clarissa Santos. She works out of the University of Sao Paulo, and she's doing her dissertation on these martins. And using some of that GPS data that we have, we shared that with these Brazilian researchers, and she went to those sites to try to see what they look like. Could she capture some birds? She's trying to tag some birds on the Brazilian end, and doing almost, they're not GPS tags, but doing almost a similar study in reverse. So she went here, and I'm gonna see if this will work. Let's see, this is supposed to be a video, but there it goes. A lot. So our bird is one of many who are roosting, and it is indeed trees along a fairly urban road, right across from the supermercado and a tire shop and whatnot. It's really interesting. Like, I never would have expected them to be somewhere quite so urban. But yeah, you can see there's definitely hundreds of birds there, and she's. She's doing this as part of her PhD work and putting on MODIS tags, which is a different type of technology, some radio telemetry technology, and banding birds. So this year we also get, I mean, it'd be a huge coincidence, but we also get to look and see if any of Clarissa's banded birds happen to come by some of the sites where we're studying birds. But yeah, very commercial part of the city. This one actually isn't a video, but you can see them attempting to catch these birds. Those are both really tall poles they have on either side of the road, and that's a whole bunch of birds flying around and several getting caught in their nets. Yeah, so pretty exciting. And the reason they could do this, put that net across the road and have no traffic, was because the night that they got there was actually a pretty major tropical storm. So this shows some trees down. The road was blocked. It gave an opportunity to do that type of netting without any cars coming by. But they also found many purple martins kind of soggy and cold, and the picture on the right's a couple laying in the road. So they were able, because they were there, they were able to take a bunch in and kind of give them a heating pad and whatnot, and got a bunch of them up and flying again. But this was really interesting to me because, you know, as a researcher from North America, I often am thinking about what we call non-breeding season mortality. So why do birds die when they're not here, you know, when they're on migration and on their wintering grounds? But it's always been kind of theoretical in my head until like seeing some of these photos, and now it's just, I don't know, it makes it much more real to think, okay, well, some of my birds don't come back because they died in a storm when their tree fell over, like in Brazil. So it's sad, but it is interesting just to think about, you know, these are some of the reasons our birds might not come back. I also think some of these birds might be vulnerable to cats and raccoons and things that can climb those trees and look for sleeping birds. Let's see. Ah, yes, and then the bird on the beach, our carnival party bird. Clarissa visited that roost as well. So there's some pictures on the right of her walking out, and again, there is a line of trees along that beach. And it's a quick photo of a kind of a similar big flock of purple martins, like swirling around over the ocean and settling down to roost in those trees. And the picture on the right, hopefully you can see there's many individuals clumped together pretty tightly. So there might be times of year where those trees are just full of purple martins. And I guess I should say they are a mix. There are some tropical species of martins that also roost in similar locations, and they will flock up together for parts of the winter. So there's probably a mix of some other martin species in there, but certainly a lot of them are purple martins. And we don't know exactly the mix of eastern to western, etc. As far as we know, only the western ones go this far south in Brazil. But there might still be more things to discover. So one of our colleagues is working on some DNA work that will give us a DNA map of the eastern versus desert versus western subspecies. And once we have that genetic map, we should be able to, or Clarissa should be able to take blood samples from martins she catches in Brazil and tell which subspecies they are. Because in the winter, you can't really tell that easily just by holding a bird or looking at it. So that's one of the future goals, is to get a sampling of all the birds at these roosts and get an idea of what proportion are from, you know, which part of the US, what proportion are purple martins versus other martins and all that. So thinking about the future, you know, we're starting to get this information. We're obviously hoping to get some more data. Scientists always want more data needed. It's one of our favorite phrases. But yeah, we want to assess the status of some of those specific sites where we saw fall migration stopover or wintering areas. It is, you know, worth talking about whether urban roosts are more at risk, either from people or pets or whatnot. The word from Clarissa is that a lot of the town members were very proud of having the purple martin colony there, but not everyone. There were still a few folks that, for instance, get annoyed at all the bird poop coming out of those trees. So when there's, you know, hundreds of birds roosting in there, they can make quite a mess, and you know, some folks think of them as more of a pest than this cool phenomenon and benefit to their town. They in fact had street cleaners, actually, that would come out early in the morning. Every morning the birds are roosting there and try to clean up the streets and the sidewalks a bit before people are out and about. So besides that kind of direct threat from people, you know, the southeastern Atlantic Brazilian forest is undergoing a lot more deforestation even than the Amazon. So there is possible that you know, some areas might be more at risk for conversion to agriculture. And I think even though, you know, we've seen a lot of our birds are at least occasionally roosting in cities, they're probably using the surrounding countryside for foraging. But that's also one of our next questions. So once we have enough information about the night roosts, the next question is, well, where are they foraging from those night roosts? And as newer GPS technology becomes available, it'll be easier to answer that question There's tags now that can take more fixes than the ones we've been working with so far. And so that's a future question we'd like to answer. And the other thing we're interested in, or the Purple Martin group as a whole is interested in, is contaminant exposure. I think there's some reason to believe some areas of Brazil might have more mercury contamination from mining happening. So part of Clarissa's dissertation is also using those samples to look at if birds wintering in different parts of Brazil have a different exposure to mercury or other contaminants. Site visits, like I mentioned, and tagging on the wintering grounds. So whether or not I get to do that personally, obviously I'd like to, but like I said, Clarissa and other Brazilian researchers are already down there doing that kind of work, just to see the migratory connectivity in the other direction. And through doing this, we've gotten engaged with the International Purple Martin Working Group, which is a really active and fun group. It includes some Eastern researchers, the director of the Purple Martin Conservation Association, a guy who works at Disney Conservation, has a big colony in Orlando, and then several folks from Brazil. So we're on almost weekly calls, talking to each other about who's doing what are the next questions, how can we work together, to better work towards the conservation of this subspecies and the species as well as a whole. And yeah, it does seem so far that the western subspecies might be more dependent on either urban areas or agricultural areas, and that it may or may not, that might make them more vulnerable to human impacts. And yeah, small sample size so far, 3 birds, but hoping for more this year. We'll be out, let's see, I think in the next 2 weeks we're going to be out at Fern Ridge looking for all the birds we tagged last year, and hopefully after that we'll have a couple more to add to this story. I wanted to kind of conclude, maybe this is a bit of a depressing note to conclude on, but something we have to keep in mind is that any bird research we do is in the context of fairly dramatic declines in our North American bird species, and that's across a lot of different types of birds, a lot of different habitat types. This is from a paper published by Rosenberg et al. In 2019 that shows we've lost about 3 billion birds since 1970. So the avifauna now is just much more reduced compared to what it was 50 years ago. And it kind of signals a bit of a broader crisis in our natural world. So, I mean, we're all facing lots of things, right? Habitat loss, climate change, increased use of pesticides. There's a lot of things going on that are, different than in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And we got to remember, birds are really a good signal of our own quality of life. So if birds are thriving, then the habitats that are making our food, water, and oxygen and all that are also thriving. And we really depend on that to keep our planet healthy enough to support birds as well as people. But I'll leave you with a few things that you can do. So while losing that 3 billion birds is a pretty staggering number, there are little things that we can all do to help. The researchers that published that study started this website called 3billionbirds.org and a campaign about 7 simple actions that people can do to help bird populations just in general. So those include preventing window collisions at home or in your business. Universities are actually getting involved in this, and bigger buildings that have a lot more windows is kind of an important, maybe easy thing that we can change the design of to prevent kind of unnecessary bird deaths. Planting native plants in your yard, reducing or avoiding pesticide use, keeping cats indoors, drinking shade-grown coffee, supporting folks in the tropics that are doing what they can to have more bird-friendly habitat. And together that's something we can do to try to keep this phenomenon of bird migration and purple martins and all our various shared international species going. So with that, I want to thank our funders, including the Forest Service, the USGS, Purple Martin Conservation Association, and Greenfield Heartline Habitat Conservation Fund, and all the folks that helped make this happen outside of my co-authors. I think that's it. With that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Are there urban roosts in North America?
Oh, good question. Yes, at least in the East. I'm not aware of any in the West, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. But yeah, I've seen some posts and some talk about, there's some famous ones in like Nashville, for instance, and I'm trying to remember the specifics, like a Nashville Opera House or something like that, that has migrating birds that stop over there every year, and it becomes a similar debate, like, oh, these birds are pooping everywhere, what do we do? And some people are like, the purple martins are awesome, let's support them and make this a thing, and some people vote for cutting down the trees. They can't roost there and poop there anymore. So yeah, there are at least some examples of that kind of trying to balance different human needs for purple martin roosts in urban areas here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
How might someone find out what you learned from the other birds?
Oh, the next one's coming up. So we post things on KBO's Facebook and blog. So I can give you a card later if you want to see how to sign up for that. But at www.klamathbird.org, there's places where you can sign up for our blog, and you get research updates on our various projects. We will eventually be publishing them in scientific journals. That's usually less visible to members of the public. But yeah, so our blog and Facebook's probably a good way to keep up with it. And then, I here and there give talks like these, and to the Purple Martin Conservation Association and other groups. So yeah, those would be the ways.
I'm aware that lights on buildings at night can throw off migration of birds. Could you talk about that some?
Yeah, I know a little bit about that. I feel like the phrase to remember is red, steady, dead. So if you can, it's best to have white lights that are blinking. They're a lot less confusing to birds. But yeah, that is something I'm not personally involved in, but yeah, lights on cell phone towers and other taller things do attract birds into areas where they sometimes do, hit windows or hit guy lines or things like that. So yeah, that is something we can think about as far as the more, maybe not in your own yard, but working towards that in a broader scale as far as cell phone companies and things.
So you're saying red is a bad color?
I think that's well, hopefully I'm not getting it mixed up, but that's the phrase I'm remembering. That you can definitely find that kind of information on like Audubon Society website. They'll have some more details about that. Yeah.
Yes, Sarah, could you talk a little bit about how birds orient, how they migrate, and
Oh, that's also a good question. Let's see, when I left grad school, this was still an open area of debate. So there are, they use magnetic fields, in part at least. We think they use the stars, at least in part. But on cloudy days, many birds can still navigate properly. And I think some of the latest research shows that they have, it's almost like being able to see infrared or something. They have some magnetic sensitive parts of their brain so that they can almost see the magnetic field, and that can help them determine, which way is north, south, east, west, kind of like an internal compass. But it seems like it might be a little aspect of their vision that they have that we don't have.
but they must use some sort of internal compass or sight to locate, to come back to the same spot.
Yeah, and the exact same spot in a lot of cases. So yeah, I think it's that mixed with, they do also follow major habitat features. So, following down the Pacific coastline or the Rocky Mountains is something that's, pretty easily seen from the air. But that's at a pretty coarse scale. So once they follow the Rockies all the way down into South America, it's really amazing that they can find the same like exact spots. Up here, it's even sometimes the same nest box year after year.
Are there any studies on how EMF pollution has affected migration?
Ooh, I don't think I can answer that. I don't have a good answer for you. I'm not familiar with any research about that. Doesn't mean it's not out there. Yeah.
So why did you choose to study purple martins, and are there other studies for other types of birds similar to this?
Oh yeah, good question. So we got interested in purple martin. Originally, I'd written a conservation assessment for them for the Forest Service and the BLM. And because they're a bird of conservation concern, it seemed more interesting to understand their migratory routes and wintering locations, and how we could apply that to conservation. One of the other major projects I work on is with Oregon vesper sparrow. It's kind of a parallel situation where there's a widespread vesper sparrow species. Our Oregon vesper sparrow subspecies is a smaller population and considered at risk. So we have been doing some GPS tagging with that subspecies as well. And then many other researchers are doing this with a broad group of different species, including in the eastern US as well as here. Bigger birds like shorebirds and raptors can take a GPS tag that transmits. So bigger birds, you can get that kind of live update data as they fly without having to recapture the bird. And folks in the east are using GPS tags on purple martins, and then, a number of other species, Swainson's thrush, some warbler species. There's a more and more we're learning about these migratory pathways of a broad range of our species, especially as the technology gets better and better. Yeah, so there are a lot of other similar studies out there.
Question, considering the different subspecies that, the desert, of course, eastern subspecies, do you see from the GPS information at all over the years any interbreeding and any particular ones that decide, well, I was eastern, now I'm going to go over to the desert just because they happen to interbreed with, one of the other subspecies?
Yeah. I think that's still an outstanding question as well, as far as there haven't been detailed studies on kind of where those ranges meet or overlap. And so that's going to require some DNA work, some genetic testing to say where exactly the boundaries are and if there are any hybrids. So that's probably coming in the future, and not by me, but one of the folks in the Purple Martin working group is a researcher at the Field Museum in Chicago, and he's doing a big genetic study, the one that we're hoping provides this DNA map we'd like to have for future use. But it's actually hard to get samples from every single population. So just currently we don't know any researchers working on that border in Arizona and New Mexico, and so currently don't have blood samples from there to work with. There is a gal named Tori, I'm going to forget her last name, but she's a grad student at Northern Arizona University, and she's also doing some DNA work, so there might be more results on that soon. I know she was asking a broad swath of various museums if she could try to take DNA from feathers, from old specimens, museum specimens, which might give us a broader geographic range than ones that folks are currently capturing right now. So yeah, we'll have to see what the results of her work are.
And also following up on that, so the purple martins, regardless of the subspecies, they all breed exclusively in North America, not in the migratory Southern American time, or do they also set up breeding areas there too?
So as far as we know, they don't breed anywhere south of northern Mexico. There probably are some in northern Mexico. Okay. But yeah, no recorded breeding in Brazil or anywhere else in Central and South America.
And is that typical of migrating species that they tend to only breed in one area versus, I mean, it doesn't need to matter, any kind of bird for that matter, or
Yeah.
are there also species that manage to breed in two different areas depending where they're wintering?
Yeah, that's a good question too. I think all the species that I know of have, well, if they're migratory, they're generally, and long distance migrants, they're breeding in their northern areas and not breeding in their southern areas. There was a paper that came out a little while ago that speculated on whether some birds do a second breeding season partway through their migration. So some western birds, I'm trying to remember the exact species, but they follow the monsoon season in western Mexico, and that paper did come out wondering if some of those birds, they thought they had some evidence that some of those birds were stopping to breed a second time in western Mexico before continuing on. But as far as I know, that hasn't been corroborated by any other papers, so I'm not sure if that's still considered a real thing or a speculative thing from just this one paper. So if it happens, it'd be unusual.
And just one last question on this topic. Are there any species that do the reverse in the sense of they breed in South America and then come to North America during the summer to just hang out, I guess?
Yeah, that's a good question too. So the southern hemisphere has what we call austral migrants that fly south into temperate areas of Chile and Argentina to breed and then fly back to the tropics.
Okay.
During the southern hemisphere winter. And then we also have some birds here that, that consider this their kind of warmer wintering grounds. And then fly back up to, Alaska and the Arctic for breeding. So there are some other broad patterns besides this one I'm describing is mostly what we call neotropical migrants, which is birds that nest here and then winter in the northern tropics. But yeah, there's a couple other broad patterns as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you know about the barn swallow that has reestablished year-round in Brazil? Are you aware of that? There's a
I don't think I am, but it is, I guess I didn't mention that in this picture of all these different migration and breeding strategies. Certainly some birds are resident. So we have resident birds here that winter here and nest here, and I'm sure Brazil does as well. But whether that includes barn swallow, I don't think I know the answer to that.
I believe it's relatively recent, and we get the barn swallows coming up from South America. And now there's a population that just sits,
That no longer
has
migrates.
decided not to migrate anymore.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Most people, the common knowledge is that we think most of our migratory birds that come up here to breed evolved in the tropics, and at one point were just tropical only birds. And then maybe as the last glacial maximum, like the glacier that was receding at the last ice age, as that opened up more habitat, and the tropics were, crowded, some birds started moving a little bit to get to those insects that were, here we have a huge flush of insects in spring. In the tropics, it's a little bit more steady all year round. And so they think tropical birds started to evolve to move small distances and then medium distances and then long distances to take advantage of the big pulse of insect resources we get up here. So it's interesting that some population might do the reverse, like stop migrating and decide to just stay. But yeah, there's tropical populations of house wrens that don't migrate either. And then there are some migratory ones because we have them here in summer and not so much winter. Yeah, so many different strategies.
Concerning the purple martin, what kind of insects do they eat here versus when they're have migrated to South America? Is there a difference?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm sure there's at least some difference, just because of the types of flying insects that are common. But I don't know enough to say specific insect species. I'm not knowledgeable enough about that. Something else related, super interesting, is that there are a lot of parasites that these birds can pick up while they're at the wintering roosts and, you know, bring here, and then, you know, there could be ticks that they get here that they take back to Brazil. There's kind of this interesting migration of bird parasites that goes along with the bird migrations. And sometimes if you get a bird here, you can tell approximately where it spent the winter because of what species of parasites it has. So that's not quite the same question as you were answering, but it's interesting and sort of related. Yeah, so we got parasites going back and forth, hitching rides on these birds too. All right, pretty good.